I want to Steelman ESG before we reveal what it actually is.
Yep.
Okay, because there are a couple. First of all, let me just say, as a lifelong progressive, I believe it is actually philosophically all but certain that our top priority ought to be sustainability properly defined. That before we get to anything else, humanity should never deliver the next generation a lesser world than the one that we were handed, right? Because if you start doing that, it's a very short ride, and there are lots of competitive dynamics that will produce that. So I understand the devil is in the details. Defining what it means not to deliver the next generation a lesser world is not an easy thing to do. So operationalizing that is not something I'm even claiming can be well done. But philosophically speaking, our obligation to future generations is something we are falling down on, and sustainability, if we were reasonable and just to use common parlance, sustainability should be our top priority before we get to anything else. And there is a game theory problem in sustainability, which I won't go deeply into, but it's a very well understood problem that goes by the name of collective action in academic circles. And basically what it means is that if each party pursues the best course of action for its own well-being, that the global well-being is decreased by lots of phenomena. In other words, the ability of any corporation to reduce pollution enough to make a difference is tiny. And so there's no motivation to cut your own emissions, because if your competitor doesn't, then they come out ahead. And so years ago, I did a talk, a TEDx talk called The Personal Responsibility Vortex, in which I basically said, if in the absence of an enforcement mechanism, if you live your principles, you will actually you will set your principles back, and that the right way to advance your principles is to do whatever course of action makes the most sense, including leaves you healthiest and all of those things, but not to, buy products for the good of the planet, but to buy the right products that are priced correctly and use the surplus to move the world in the direction of the values that you hold, rather than try to do it by shopping in a particular way. Because if you did try to leave a sustainable world, then you couldn't avail yourself of almost any of the products that, this microphone is undoubtedly made of materials that I wouldn't like how they were sourced and produced and the conditions of the workers. So am I not allowed to have a microphone? And by not having a microphone, I can't reach the audience and tell them about the personal responsibility vortex. So am I better off making a compromise at the microphone and being able to reach an audience? Clearly. So, in any case, ESG is built around some correct logic and values. The correct logic and values. The values are, we want a world that functions well, that's fair, that is inclusive, that is sustainable, and
The stated goals of ESG.
that's it. And it is true that the market itself does not produce sustainable outcomes. It does not produce fair outcomes, right? It produces something below that level. And so a coordinated effort is in principle not a crazy idea. But in this case, what ESG is an excuse to marshal power in the direction of a political objective which is not stated. And so, for example, let's take the question of E in ESG, right? Environment. Okay, environment. Well, we all want the environment protected. Brett just said that the top value ought to be sustainability, so presumably he's on board with 15-minute cities. No, I am not. 15-minute cities are an excuse for control over the population. I am dead set against those things. But if some entity decides that, sustainability is good, and therefore 15-minute cities are good, and therefore we want corporations who are advancing the cause of 15-minute cities, and they get a higher rating, which means that when I look at the box of whatever, it says that they're a better corporation, right? Then the point is, the political agenda is using this thing as a weapon. And
that's what I meant by the lack of specificity. that they vaguely state some values that in principle, in very vague terms, we all should be able to get behind. And this, I guess this is the analogy to the Dylan Mulvaney thing. It's like, well, it's civil rights. We can all get behind that, can't we? And then they say, now you don't worry your pretty little heads about any of the specifics, and we'll take care of the operationalization part of this process, because that's inside baseball. You wouldn't want to know. And as it turns out, we really do want to know. We have to know, and you have to stop until you start telling us what it is that you're doing, because this is bad.
Right. Now, here's the thing that I realized in thinking through this. ESG is social credit for corporations. It is a social credit system for corporations. And I'm sure others have noticed that.
That's
but
why I showed the end, because they said that.
Oh, they do? Okay.
They say scores.
They say scores, but the point is, those of us who know what the Chinese social credit system is fear such a thing being instituted in the West. We fear it being instituted through central bank digital currencies, for example, all of which is very plausible and on the march. The idea that this has a wing over in corporate space that is going to operate through ratings agencies that are, for example, going to decide that trans rights are a good. Now, are trans rights a good? Yes, up until they are in conflict with somebody else's rights. But the idea that a ratings agency is going to notice that a trans person may have struggles in the world and not notice that children are being sterilized under the banner of trans rights, right? Which side is good, right? I would say that the people who are protecting children are actually doing the more important job. And so it's not obvious in which direction that score should go, but it is very obvious which direction it will go. And so why does this exist?
Right.
Well, I'm going to argue, and you should probably be sitting down for this. I know that chair can pull surprises on you, but
that was all me.
Yeah, you can't just go randomly flipping levers on chairs, right? In any case, the reason that this ESG thing is happening, in my opinion, is that it is a facilitator of this new kind of fascism that we are seeing. And I'm not exaggerating when I say fascism. So fascism is, of course, an ideology that has reared its ugly head many times. The sine qua non, the central feature of fascism, is the uniting of government and corporate power. And ESG, as a social credit system for corporations, is basically aligning corporations with a handed down from above set of values. Now, handed down from above set of values, if the government functioned in a truly democratic way so that those values were really a reflection of what voters believed and wanted, that would be one thing. It would still be fallible, but it would at least be defensible. But when it's being handed down by something that is not functioning in a democratic way in the slightest, it is absolutely terrifying, right? I would also point out, is it just the corporate government fusion that appears fascist? No, fascists also take a militaristic view of the world. In other words, I have argued that the distinction between nationalism and patriotism is that nationalism is basically what your country can do for you, using your country as a bludgeon. And patriotism is the willingness to sacrifice for your country. They're essentially opposites. They have a shared connotation in the mind, but it's wrong. So this corporate government partnership or fusion, this fascist fusion, has taken a decidedly militaristic view of the world. It is effectively coercing other nations, and you can see the coercion in COVID policy, for example. Why did the whole world take the same approach to COVID? Why are we struggling to find exceptions where we can go to measure a different policy? It wasn't obvious what we should do from the beginning. There should be a huge diversity of policies, but it's all centralized through, the WHO, for example, which is about to gain more power in this milieu.
Well, I mean, obviously there's a tension, and I'm surprised to find myself about to be arguing that, as we said throughout COVID, not this product with this disease with this government, like no mandates, no how under these three conditions. But can you imagine a pathogen so horrifying and so rapidly spreading that a global response was actually the thing that needed to happen? I can. That we don't have that infrastructure in place, and now, having lived through COVID, I am, bereft of solutions, I guess. Like, I feel like, I would have thought that we should have had something in place in case of such a situation. And now I see that no such situation, no such entity could possibly be trustworthy.
It remains to be seen whether a conceivable entity could be trustworthy. What we know is that no entity that is on the map is trustworthy, and therefore it puts...
But all future entities will also be made up of people.
Right, but I don't think the game theory is insurmountable. I don't think good governance is impossible, but...
I don't think good governance is impossible. I am not compelled that good global governance is possible anymore.
Let's put it this way. We are depending on the fact that somebody can come up with a scheme, but the solutions of the 18th century are not up to the challenge.
That is true.
What we have is a landscape full of malignant entities. And so I agree. I'd love to have a global public health authority that actually was interested in public health, had enough humility to figure out when it was making an error and stop making it, was inclined to recommend the obvious in order to improve public health. And we have none of those things.
Right. Even the WHO continues to recommend, as it was doing before COVID, through COVID, and now, that if you go outside while the sun is high, you absolutely must cover yourself in sunscreen or clothing because the sun is poison.
Yeah.
And I don't know that they use that language, but it's not them. But
Right.
then who is it?
Which is insane.